This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Hey, Hot Takes. Welcome to Hot Take. I'm Amy Westervelt.
And I'm Mariana East Hegler. Oh my God, I'm so glad you're back. I don't have to say hotcakes anymore.
I'm actually surprised you didn't force your guest co-host to do it.
I did it. I got through it. I didn't laugh. I made it. I channeled my inner Amy and just braved my way through. Anyway, how are you? How is Costa Rica?
I'm good. Costa Rica's great. Yeah, I feel like I've just kind of jumped right in here. It's awesome. It's good.
Yeah.
Seeing a lot of cool animals every day, which is
Have you
fun.
seen any sloths?
I have seen sloths. I have seen monkeys.
Oh my God.
I also had to get rid of a scorpion that was camped out in the corner of my room. So
Okay, less cute. Less cute. Have you seen any bats?
yes, seen some bats.
You have?
Mm-hmm. Seen some very cute
my
bats.
gosh.
Yeah, actually, honestly, I have to say, like, people talk about how this is like the most biodiverse country in the world and all that stuff, and like it just, I don't know. I honestly was like, I don't really know what that means, and then I came here, and I mean, I know what it means, like on paper, but I came here and I feel like every day I'm seeing different, like a gazillion different butterflies and, you know, random insects I've never seen and cool birds, and yeah, it's cool. I like it.
That is so awesome.
Yeah.
How are people in Costa Rica taking the news that Joe Manchin has COVID?
You know, one really great thing about being here is that nobody is keeping track of U.S. politics.
No, not one person?
I don't know anyone, like no one has even mentioned it to me, but it's fun for me to, you know, to keep tabs from afar. I know it makes me happy to learn that Joe Manchin has COVID. I hope it triggers his black lung. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh.
Just kidding, Joe Manchin.
Leave that in. I mean, I don't know. We'll see what happens. It's like, I don't know.
I know.
I don't know what is going to happen with that guy.
I know.
It's just,
he's the worst.
He always comes back.
Yeah.
Well, you came back for the perfect week because this week we're going to talk about prisons.
Yes.
That was not the right tone.
That's
the wrong tone.
Wrong tone. But I do
Awful tone.
Enjoy having these conversations because they're super interesting, and there's still a ton of people who are like, what does climate have to do with prison abolition? So I feel like, you know, we cannot have this conversation enough. Longtime hotcakes will remember that we did an episode on prison abolition back in 2021 with Drew Costley, but there's always a lot more to talk about, even if that episode was like 2 hours long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Remains one of my favorite conversations on here. And since then, Aline Brown has published an amazing body of work over at The Intercept about the intersections between climate change and prisons. And I'm really excited that we get to talk to her today.
Yeah, me too. Yes, Aline has since left The Intercept, but she's still an amazing journalist. She's still working on this subject, and she has a deep wealth of knowledge about all of it. So we're really excited she was able to make it.
So let's get her on here. I think it's time.
It's time to talk about climate. Welcome, Aline Brown, to Hot Take. Thanks for being here.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
One of the things that I was just blown away by in your work was this massive climate and punishment project that you did when you were at The Intercept, where you guys tracked hundreds of prisons and what kind of climate risks people were at when they were incarcerated in them. Could you tell us a little bit about just kind of how that project came about? Because I feel like when it came out, there still was, and there probably still is today, there still was kind of a lack of understanding about how these two things were connected. So yeah, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you came to that connection.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as an environmental justice reporter, I feel like I'm always looking for how the climate crisis is impacting the most vulnerable people. And I think criminalized populations definitely fit into that category. So, I was looking at, covering the intersection between the climate crisis and prisons. And I think maybe did one or two stories, like one-off stories about climate impacts in prisons. And I saw other people doing the same here and there, but there didn't seem to be any really comprehensive look about how the climate crisis was going to be impacting the system of mass incarceration. So I got with my wonderful colleague, Akil Harris, who is a data reporter and really just excellent journalist and human. And we started thinking about how we might map the climate crisis against mass incarceration. So basically, we took this database of more than 6,500 jails, prisons, ICE detention centers, juvenile detention centers, and mapped them. We were able to map them against indicators of heat risk, wildfire risk, and flood risk, and just came out with this really disturbing picture of how much risk these facilities are already facing and how it's about to get a lot worse.
Was there anything that really jumped out at you as oh wow, I was not expecting that, or yeah, I don't know. I'm curious also to hear if any facility was actually starting to look at this in any kind of a real way in terms of preparing to.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would say the scope of the issue or the scope of the impact already was disturbing to me. We found that more than a third of detention facilities in the U.S. are in areas that historically have had more than 50 days a year annually with a heat index above 90 degrees. So that's enough to make people dealing with a lot of health issues sick. Mm-hmm. By the end of the century, that proportion is likely to go up to 3/4 of detention facilities across the U.S. So that was really disturbing. I mean, right now, no carceral institutions are located in a county with more than 50 days annually at 105 degrees, which is just dangerous. By 2100, almost 700 facilities are likely to be at that level, mostly in Texas, Florida, and Louisiana. But a lot of things surprised me about the reporting. One thing that, with the heat, we were really looking at these prolonged periods of high heat. But I spoke to this researcher, Julie Scarha, who was looking at how heat impacts mortality rates. And she actually found that a heat index above 90 degrees in a prison in the Northeast can increase mortality by as much as 18%, which is a lot more than in the South, where people might be more acclimated to that level of heat. That's not to mention those jumps to 105 degrees, which is going to be dangerous for anyone. But I thought that was really striking.
One of the things that really surprised me in looking at the project was that when you mapped the facilities with the greatest flood risk, none of them were in Louisiana, and that Florida has more facilities at risk from fire than California. Can you talk a little bit about how that comes about?
Yes, those details were totally stunning to me. Yeah, I mean, so with floods, a lot of it comes down to these just incredibly widespread infrastructure problems that have nothing to do with flood risk per se. Or, they do have everything to do with that, but not flood risk when we're thinking of a FEMA flood map, for example. We found, as you're saying, we found that a lot of facilities that have a history of flooding did not actually have really high flood risk. And the thing is, if a facility is high up on a hill, but the roof is falling apart and the sewage is a mess, when a big storm comes through, it's not going to go well, So a lot of the facilities that have had some of the worst flooding problems, they might even be no flood risk or moderate flood risk. And where it comes to wildfires, one of the highest risk facilities is this Everglades Correctional Institution in Florida. You know, it may be located next to a swamp, but that foliage just really lights up when it gets hot and sparks fly. So wildfire risk, according to the researchers I was speaking to, is really, wildfires really create major problems, mostly in the West right now. But that risk is present across the U.S. You know, Texas and Florida, like you're saying, have a lot of facilities facing a lot of wildfire risk that might, you know, come to fruition in flames in the decades to come, I guess, or next year. You know, we don't know.
Yeah. It makes me think of that Tennessee wildfire from, was it late last year? Yeah, these things are happening in places that we're not used to them happening.
Right. I think also too, I mean, one of the things that we've talked about a few times before is just all the studies, and I feel like there's more coming out all the time that connect extreme heat with increased violence in general. So both, you know, domestic violence and violent crime, but also police brutality and like sort of aggressive police behavior towards people. And I wonder if that's something that has cropped up at all in your reporting too, Aline. Like if it's, when I was reading your project, I just kept thinking of like, geez, there's more people being incarcerated. Like the incarceration rates are being impacted by climate in some ways too. And then once people are there, there's all this additional risk that they're kind of trapped in. It's this really, I don't know, depressing knot of things that collide. Anyway, I'm curious if you've done any reporting on that connection as well.
I think that is a really important connection. I haven't personally done a ton of reporting on the way arrest rates go up when it gets really hot, but I'm quite sure that is the case. You know, a lot of people right now in New York, for example, it's really hot. And if you don't have air conditioning, you're going to be hanging out outside. You know, law enforcement sees a lot of Black and brown people hanging out outside and arrest rates go up. So those people end up in facilities that are not air conditioned. You know, if we're talking about New York again, Rikers, folks were reporting that air conditioning was out in at least one of the facilities over the past week or two. You know, so yeah, the heat sort of helps funnel people into this system where the heat makes it just all the more, I guess, cruel and unusual, you know? And I would also say that a similar thing plays out if you're thinking about migration, you know? So a big hurricane hits Central America and a country doesn't have the capacity to deal with the damage. And a lot of people end up crossing the US-Mexico border where they are criminalized and ultimately may end up in ICE detention centers that also are unprepared for the climate crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What you were saying a minute ago about the heat also made me think about heat can increase the amount of violence within the prison, both from the correction officers and in between the prisoners. And I often wonder about like people who go into jail, like not convicted of anything, probably a lot of them may be there for no reason, but wind up in fights or other like sort of skirmishes in prison that make them wind up staying there longer, or people who get into fights or, you know, are the victims of violence and then get put into solitary confinement in a heat wave. I don't know. I'm not expecting an answer there, but that's like just something keeps me up at night.
No, it seems like one of those situations where there's like a lot of compounding things, right? Like a lot of dominoes falling, and this is just one more factor that can exacerbate that. And then you've got people who are, you know, not convicted of anything. They're just being held because they can't make bail, right?
Right.
Another example that's kind of like that is, you know, the way the system of mass incarceration ends up being a stand-in for like minimal mental health support in communities.
Yeah.
So, you know, psychotropic medications, which are used to treat a lot of mental health issues, a lot of them make you more sensitive to heat. So, you know, it's like you're saying, it's a lot of issues compounding.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Another thing I want to just mention too before we move on to other stuff is that there are a lot of connections between fossil fuel companies and police forces in the form of funding, particularly in oil-heavy states. So I know I've reported on this in Richmond, California. Chevron helped the Richmond police force have 50% larger police force than other towns in the area. I know that oil companies are, quite supportive of police in Louisiana and in Texas. And I wonder if this is something that you've seen too, Eileen, like this connection between that industry in particular and incarceration.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that the area where my reporting has focused on that is around the criminalization of land defenders.
Oh, yeah.
So, I did a bunch of reporting in Minnesota on the construction of Enbridge's Line 3 pipeline, which local Anishinaabe people really kind of rose up against. And in that case, the Public Utility Board set up this account so that Enbridge, the pipeline company, would directly fund policing related to the pipeline.
Yeah. And they're a Canadian company, just to make sure people understand what's going on there. This is an escrow account that a Canadian company set up and put money in that was then used to hire police who then arrested American citizens for protesting.
Right.
That whole thing was insane. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, off-duty law enforcement officers are also routinely used by fossil fuel companies, security companies.
Yeah.
There's other instances, like what you're reporting in Richmond is a great example. And also in Oregon with the Jordan Cove, the planned Jordan Cove LNG export facility. Again, they set up this LNG funded police unit that was involved with monitoring opposition to this project that wasn't even ultimately constructed. So there is a long history of this stuff.
Right. And I think related to that, it's good to just note that there is a big push right now to make the criminal fines and sentences harsher for people who are caught protesting around quote unquote critical infrastructure, which includes, pipelines, power lines. I mean, honestly, in some cases it includes roads and like railroads too. So you can see how this could start to really just become an all out criminalization of protest across the board.
Are they specific about what near infrastructure means? Like, is it subjective?
It depends on the state.
Okay.
Some of them are explicit and some of them are pretty vague. And then the punishments also depend. Like in some states, it can extend to organizations that have helped to plan protests. So like that happened in the Standing Rock cases with Greenpeace. It also happened, I think, when one of the Greenpeace protesters did a blockade in Texas too. So there's some states where, the organization can be part of it. But one state recently passed a critical infrastructure bill that made it okay to use RICO against protesters. So basically, these are laws that were created to deal with organized crime. And they're now saying, you can use that against protest groups, which I'm like, wow, okay. This is, and I feel like it's, it's been covered a little bit. Your reporting has been great on this stuff, Eileen, and I know Alex Kaufman at HuffPost, too, has done a bunch of reporting on this. And, there's been some stories, but I feel like the fact that, we're getting close to half of states have these bills on the books now. And there's a bunch more being proposed. There have been national versions proposed. None have passed yet, but it's pretty scary. I've also heard stories about really shady shit, like people calling CPS on land defenders, for example, and like Child Protective Services. So like if you're out at a protest, they're sending Child Protective Services to your house and questioning, whether you're a negligent parent, for example.
Oh my God, really that is diabolical.
Really fucked up. Yeah. So I think for, probably reasons that are rooted in, long-standing racism and colonialism, there's like this really intense fear of Indigenous protest in particular. And
yes,
like, man, the organized response to it is scary. And will absolutely affect like anyone else who might protest anything as well, Yeah. Anyway, sorry, rabbit hole, but I think it's so important. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, Aline. It's gross.
Yeah. Yeah. And with that legislation that you're talking about too, it was the American Legislative Exchange Council that, ALEC, that was pushing a lot of that. They had model legislation that...
It was written by the American fuel and petrochemical manufacturers guys and then handed to ALEC. Yeah, it's gross. Totally, like 100% industry funded, written, and orchestrated. It's gross. Really gross.
So we are going to get into where the media has been on this story, but really quick, just need to take an ad break.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold, soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
So the media has traditionally done not the greatest job of connecting the dots on prisons and climate, but work like yours and Drew Costley's and some other reporters that Amy's mentioned, I feel like it's starting to change that. Does it seem like from where you are, people are getting how and why the two things are connected?
I feel like this year I'm starting to see more local reporting, especially around prisons and heat. Over the last few weeks, obviously it's been just deadly hot in a lot of states. And, I saw reports from Massachusetts, Oklahoma, New York, Florida, Texas about prisons that lack air conditioning and how it is really risky for the people inside. So, I think local reporting is so important. And I think it's heartening to see people drawing attention to that. I don't know if the climate crisis connection is always made. It would be good to see more underlining the fact that, yeah, it's bad now, but it's going to get worse. I think that just adds a lot of urgency, and I would love to see more reporters incorporating that into their work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So think fast. What are the top reasons climate and prisons are connected?
Structural racism. Structural racism. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I mean, the top reasons climate and prisons. I mean, these are people that have been dubbed by our power systems as people that are no longer valuable, that have crossed a line and that, deserve to be punished. So, if we have these, if they're then in the care of the state that has given them this designation, do we trust that same state, which is already kind of stripped of resources, that they're going to fully fund these facilities that they've set up and take care of the people that they, don't feel great about? I've just heard a lot of people argue that environmental crisis is sort of inherent to the system of mass incarceration because it's never going to be a top funding priority. Mm-hmm. So, even in cases where there are legislators pushing for air conditioning funding, education isn't being fully funded. Do we think that prisons are going to be? And I mean, that aside, a lot, the abolitionist argument is that we shouldn't be spending a bunch of money installing air conditioning. Instead, the only real solution to a prison system that is subject to more heat and more kind of climate-induced crises is decarceration and shutting these facilities down.
Amy, I want your opinion too. And then, I have one, of course. But
I feel like you get the corrupt and kind of overburdened mass incarceration system in the U.S. from a lot of the same drivers as the climate crisis, right? It's power imbalance. It's the idea that some people get to decide what other people are worth. It's major kind of structural issues where those who are most vulnerable are being put in a position to be most impacted by, this system and by climate change and by lots of other kind of entrenched systemic injustices. So yeah, I kind of see them as like two sides of the same coin, or maybe better put, like two squares in the same Rubik's Cube.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think one of the main reasons is that, there but by the grace of God go every single one of us. Like it doesn't take much, really, especially depending on your demographics, to wind up inside of one of these institutions. But also, we should care about them because they're people and they still matter. And the other thing I think about a lot is that prisoners are on the front lines of the impacts of climate change, and they're also like the first people tapped to respond to a disaster, from the firefighters, right? Like, we've got all these images of prisoners as firefighters, but also like they tend to salt the sidewalks after a blizzard or help to build the levees, and that practice goes back really, really far. And I don't know how to look at that without seeing slavery. So that's another reason. And another thing that Drew talked about when we had him on last time, Drew Costley, about how prisons actually generate a lot of carbon. And so a prisoner can have a higher carbon footprint through no choice of their own, simply by the fact of being in prison, which is like kind of crazy.
Yeah, that is incredible.
Let's talk more about the prison labor thing, because I feel like that is something that a lot of people still don't necessarily know about. But yeah, especially as there are more and more extreme weather events that require labor to deal with in various ways. A lot of that labor is prison labor.
And I would also mention, I was just talking with someone who is incarcerated in a facility that lacks air conditioning. And this individual, their job, or it was a family member of this individual, their job is to keep the ice filled in this unair conditioned prison. That's like what the state is like, we're not going to put air conditioning in, but we'll give you guys ice. So it's a person who's incarcerated that has to keep that ice filled. And he said he is working 7 days a week, to mitigate this problem that the prison system has created, and, has become kind of ill from working so hard and not getting a break and working without climate control.
Wow. Yeah. It's crazy. And in a lot of these instances, Mary, you mentioned the firefighters. I know this is true of them, and I'm pretty sure it's true of some of the other folks who are kind of pressed into disaster relief work. They're acquiring skills that they're then not even allowed to kind of put on a resume and use later. I think California just passed a law this past year that changes that. And they're the first, and I think so far the only state that's done that allows people who get training as firefighters while they're incarcerated to actually have that on their resume and have that count towards some kind of certification when they get out. But for years, people were just doing this, like, they get paid $1 to $2 an hour and that's it. And I think it's Arizona, in just the last couple of years, they actually now have more incarcerated firefighters than non-incarcerated firefighters. Which is like pretty
It's
staggering.
just so crazy to me that like these folks are locked up because they're supposed to be a threat to public safety. But then when there's an actual threat to public safety,
right,
these are the people we put on the front lines.
Yeah.
And it's like, it seems so inhumane to send them back to prison after that.
Well, and when you ask, yes. When you ask them about that, they're like, "Oh no, it's fine because they're only in for like low-level misdemeanors, like drunk driving or this or that." And I'm like, "Then why are they? Just let them out then."
Right.
Right. Well, and I'm curious to see how much we'll see that increase. Because again, thinking about these, like the austerity that so many local communities are living under, if we're seeing more and more climate crisis impacts and the state is figuring out how to fund it without ever raising taxes and, without ever taxing the wealthy or minimally taxing the wealthy, where are they going to get free labor? So I think that's something that needs to be watched really closely moving forward.
Yeah.
I mean, another thing to think about in these prisons, like we were talking about, they can have a bigger carbon footprint without any, fault of their own. So prisoners are counted on the census for where they are incarcerated, but they don't get to vote at all. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of becomes this modern version of the 3/5 compromise.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and then that made me think of how, a lot of times when people are talking about climate action and the need for climate policy and all that stuff, the response is often vote, right? Well, in this case, not only can you not vote, but also like your existence is being potentially used to rig the system to block any kind of climate policy.
Right. Right.
So it's really like,
it's really hard to move through those systems. Yeah.
When you were talking, Aline, about the free labor thing and like where are these places going to get, free or very cheap labor in a way that doesn't impact wealthy people, it just makes me think of the fact that a lot of these places are on the sites of former slave plantations. And like, that's the whole thing, right? It's always in this country, like, how are we going to, get more free and cheap labor without bothering wealthy people. And Angola in Louisiana is an example of that, where it was built on a former, plantation that used enslaved people for labor. And, they're badly impacted by climate issues. There's a lot of flooding there, a lot of heat, and a lot of minimally compensated labor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a plantation. It never stopped being a plantation.
Right. It's like it changed the name on the outside, but it's the same place all along.
Did they change the name on the outside? I don't even know.
Just I'm guessing from like plantation to prison.
Yeah. Oh, right. They changed that part. So one of the things we've talked a lot about is the lack of air conditioning in these prisons.
Yeah.
Tuning in from Louisiana in July, it's hot. So I was wondering, what do you think is next in the battle for air conditioning in prisons? I know you've written about how Texas is currently ground zero, and it's also the state with an isolated power grid. I'm seeing all these notices about turn off air conditioning during these hours for just like regular citizens.
Yep.
And it makes me think of during the California drought, they turned off the outside showers for prisoners in California. So I'm wondering what happens in these prisons when there's calls to cut power consumption. Also, what do you think is next for air conditioning in prisons?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, there's so much there. I mean, big picture, I would say that we're really kind of at a crossroads in terms of because of the climate crisis, in terms of what is going to happen with these prisons. Basically, I believe they're either going to have to invest millions and billions of dollars into infrastructure for these facilities because the heat is going to get a lot worse and there's going to be wrongful death lawsuits and they don't want those. So, it's going to force the states to move. So, already I think we're seeing more states talking about installing air conditioning a lot of places that didn't want to were just utterly uninterested in the past. Suddenly you see politicians or at least corrections officials kind of moving on it. I'm not saying that that's going to happen quickly, but Mississippi, for example, just set aside a bunch of funding or just committed, I guess, to install air conditioning in all its prisons. Some of that coming from, COVID relief funds, ARPA funds. So,
that's so interesting.
So on the one hand, I think we're going to see a lot of places actually installing air conditioning in the decades ahead, or maybe even in the years ahead. But I think that a lot of people are pointing out, rightfully, that it's unlikely to really resolve the problem for exactly the reasons that you're describing. Already in California, for example, and probably other states, but California is the one I'm kind of familiar with, when they ask community members to turn off their air conditioning or lessen their energy usage during a heat wave, people who are incarcerated don't have a choice. Those facilities at times are basically cut off from the grid and put on generator power, which doesn't always actually power the climate control systems where they exist. So an air-conditioned facility might no longer be air-conditioned during the hottest times of the year. I think we'll see prisons are always going to be the first ones to have their climate controls and air conditioning shut off when the grid is under pressure. So we can invest all this money into new prison infrastructure or start thinking really seriously about decarceration and different kinds of systems of accountability, because something's got to give.
Yeah. I just looked up, what you were saying about Mississippi, and this is the first headline I see. After 121 scalding Mississippi summers, Parchman Prison is getting air conditioning.
Yep.
Well, I mean, I guess that's an improvement. I would like to see the prison not be there anymore, but...
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. For people who are inside, it's just... the descriptions I hear, a lot of people compare it to like a hot car, a sauna. It's just that kind of completely oppressive heat that you cannot escape. And it's really dangerous for a lot of people.
Yeah. I feel like, the stories I hear about, like some of the most extreme cruelty in prison usually happens when it's really hot.
Yeah, I mean, back to this issue of violence and heat. I mean, I have a short fuse when it's hot out. It's like, so not only are people, not only are people perhaps facing more police violence on the streets, perhaps being arrested at higher rates, but inside of these facilities, I'm hearing that a lot of times the corrections officers are harsher during the heat. There's also more fights inside during the heat. And again, getting back to this issue of, will infrastructure adjustments solve the problem? Already, I've heard a number of accounts of climate control being used as punishment when somebody does something that a corrections officer doesn't like. So, the fans being turned off because someone complained about something, or heat or air conditioning being blasted because someone complained or did something that the officer didn't like. So I think there's a lot.
Yeah, I heard about that during the Texas freeze.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
That is disgusting. Isn't that a human rights violation? I mean, like, what? I know that there are lots of things that would qualify as human rights violations in U.S. prisons, but like, I am curious if there's any kind of body even outside of the country that's looking at this from that standpoint.
Yes. Outside the country, I think that there has been some movement, but I can't speak directly to it. I mean, within the U.S. court system, there have been rulings that a lack of, or I guess heat in certain prisons constitutes Eighth Amendment violations, so cruel and unusual punishment, as well as violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And basically, it's like if they know that the heat is dangerous to people and they're not doing anything about it, then, that can constitute cruel and unusual punishment. And by now they know, So I think there is some legal precedent. And there's no way 105, 110 degrees in one of these facilities, there's just no way that you can argue that that's not a human rights violation, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it can get even hotter inside the prison, I believe, because they're constructed of materials that retain heat, and also they tend to be in really humid places like Texas. So, so
right, and the heat index too is the real, the combination of heat, temperature, and humidity often is a lot higher than the actual temperature.
Right. I know I have that thing on my phone now that I actually look at now that I live in a warm, humid place where it's like humidity is this, which means it feels like it's 97, even though it's 90 or whatever,
That's important.
So, yeah, it is. Yeah, really, it makes a big difference.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I feel like heat is one of those it's definitely an acute climate impact, but it's kind of like it stays and sits for a while. And I want to talk more about the ones that kind of like spike up like hurricanes and fires. But again, ad break.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Hey, Fidelity. How can I remember to invest every month?
With the Fidelity app, you can choose a schedule and set up recurring investments in stocks and ETFs.
Oh, that sounds easier than I thought.
You got this.
Yeah, I do. Now, where did I put my keys?
You will find them where you left them.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC.
So another thing about prisons, and I think we need to talk more about it in terms of climate change, is how do you evacuate a prison when there's a fire nearby or a hurricane approaching? And that's one of the saddest things about the situation of prisons during a disaster, because they don't get to decide when to leave. They don't I was thinking about that as I was evacuating for Hurricane Ida, which is the first time I've ever that's the first time I've ever evacuated for a storm before. And it was I had all of this agency. I had all of this autonomy to decide, do I leave it this day? Do I leave it all? What do I take with me? And they don't have that power. They don't have that privilege.
We talked about this, I think, Mary, because I was having I was evacuating from a fire at the same time that Mary was evacuating from a hurricane. And we talked about this, geez, because it was the same kind of thing. Do I stay? Do I go? There's that window of time. And not being able to make that decision at all or have any control over it would be really terrifying.
Exactly.
Right?
And knowing that the people who have the power to make that decision for you have not necessarily shown you that they care about your life.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of cases, they just don't evacuate those facilities because, it is a logistical nightmare to evacuate hundreds or thousands of people that have been dubbed security concerns in the middle of a hurricane or wildfire. So just because a community has been dubbed an evacuation zone and everyone's told to leave does not at all mean jails or prisons in the area will be evacuated, because they're thinking about a whole different set of issues, not only looking at the security threat that the fire or storm represents, but also what they believe to be the security threat that these people represent. So sometimes that might override what would be an obvious evacuation situation for everyone else. So in a lot of cases, they're just left in these places.
Horrifying. Yeah, I don't think I've only heard of like 1 or 2 prison evacuations because of an event like this. I was wondering if you found any instances in your reporting of when administrations actually practice evacuations, or even anything as simple as a tornado drill. Like, are prisoners getting any sort of training on this, how to handle themselves in a disaster?
I would say it varies pretty dramatically, I think state to state, and even facility to facility. I have at least one person describe to me some kind of like evacuation practice run that they did, like a drill. But they said they believed that it was in part, a move that would allow guards to go in and search their stuff. So they didn't feel like they really came out of it with a lot of understanding of how to actually handle a situation should it arise. And most of the people I've spoken to said that they've never done any kind of drill.
Wow. Yep, that's what I expected, but not what I hoped for.
Yeah.
What about earthquakes, too? Sorry, that's not a climate one. It just got me thinking. Wow.
Okay, I'm going to ask a real dumb question, I guess, but what do you do?
There's no such thing as dumb questions, Mary. I'm just kidding.
Well, what do you do in an earthquake? Like, you just...
Oh, I don't know.
There's nowhere to run.
Oh, you definitely don't run. You actually get into a doorway of a building. That's the safest place.
Oh.
Because there's like, especially if you're in a state that has earthquakes like California, it's like seismically designed so that the structure will not like come down on your head. It used to be like when I was a kid, they would have us practice getting under desks, but then they were like, oh no, that's dumb. Doorways. Yeah, that's what you do. But then, like post a big earthquake, you have no electricity, you have no water. I know there was one in Hawaii a while ago that I was in, and we didn't have power or water for like 5 days after. So then, in a prison situation, I would imagine that can happen with hurricanes and fires too. It's like not just the immediate crisis, but also then what do you do when like the one good news story we read about this was that one that you found, Mary, where people actually swam out of a prison that was flooded.
Oh, in the Philippines. Did you hear about this?
No, I don't think so.
There was a typhoon in the Philippines in 2013, and it was like a dozen or so prisoners actually escaped by swimming away.
Wow, amazing.
I think they were recaptured, but still, like for a moment there.
Right. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
But yeah, an example of like multiple things that you guys have just brought up is last year in Susanville, California. There were wildfires, I think multiple wildfires, or maybe a complex of wildfires was threatening Susanville, California. People were told to get ready to evacuate. A lot of people were evacuating, and there's multiple prisons around Susanville. So at one of those prisons, the California Correctional Center, I spoke to folks who were inside, and they were terrified about what was going to happen and if they were going to evacuate. But not only that, also, they had been without power for weeks because the wildfires had taken down power lines that fed the grid that they were a part of. So they were supposed to be on generator power. Well, in one of the yards, the generator was not working properly. So people were basically sitting in the dark for weeks on end. The ventilation system would totally go out at times. So they're dealing with this like bad smoke, obviously terrible for people who have respiratory issues. And if the power goes out, you're on lockdown. They don't let you like go be in communal areas like you normally would, as many phone calls as you normally would, etc. And with the power outages in other cases, and maybe in this one too, but I'm not totally sure, I've spoken to people who've dealt with power outages during hurricanes, and one of the issues that comes up a lot is that the toilets stop working. So you end up with like feces piling up. It's really nasty.
Horrible smell. Horrible smell.
Horrible smell with bad ventilation because you don't have any power. So it's bad.
Yeah. And also like just like huge potential for spread of illness and all kinds of just really gross.
Yeah, I gotta say, Aline, I noticed that as a theme in your work.
Oh, which
like
one?
Rotting sewage in prisons.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's true and it's gross, and so like we have to talk about it.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, like it's really gross, but it's also a really severe health impact.
Yeah,
or health risk.
Yeah, totally. Like people don't feel like they can go to the bathroom, and if they do go to the bathroom, they're it's piling up in sometimes these like communal dormitories with a lot of people. This individual, Angel, who I profiled in one of my stories, like we were discussing, he left Honduras during Hurricane Mitch, came to the U.S., and was eventually arrested for an incident that he attributes to self-defense. Spent 7 years in prison, which is what the, state deemed appropriate, and then was sent straight to ICE detention because he was undocumented. So then he was in ICE detention for another 7 years, which is really a long time for ICE detention,
Yeah.
So, and he just repeatedly, this basically climate migrant, repeatedly faced really nasty climate issues in ICE detention, including this incident where in Louisiana, where I think it was Hurricane Laura came through and the toilets weren't working, ventilation wasn't working right. And he said people were defecating on the trays that food had been served on because the toilets were too full and it was just gross. Yeah. So this guy has asthma. That was really aggravated. He couldn't eat. It's just like horrific conditions that you could not wish on anyone. And this person at that point was in this situation because he refused to drop his asylum claim. So it's just awful.
Wow.
Oh, that makes me so angry.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah. Well, I mean, the ICE detention centers in general, like so many people are there in part, at least, because of some kind of climate-related thing, right? Like maybe there was a disaster or there's a drought or, I know there are other things too, but even in cases where it's violence, like sometimes that's been exacerbated by climate disasters. And then they get stuck in these places where they're at even bigger risk of these extreme weather events. I just yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, again, so many of us like move or make choices, really like move, do something to make ourselves feel better or feel safer when a storm, fire, or even heat is coming at us. These people are totally at the mercy of a state that has deemed them criminals.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yep. And there's, a lot of these states are run by, this crime and punishment party that thinks that, like, if you've been convicted of something, you don't deserve any kindness, any mercy ever again for the rest of your life, which is just a crazy way to think.
Even if your only quote-unquote crime is, like, trying to move out of the path of some other disaster, climate or otherwise, I just,
Yeah.
It's very depressing.
Yeah. So another thing I learned from your reporting is that for 2 years running, Senator Tammy Duckworth has introduced a bill that will require the borough to submit detailed annual damage reports describing how federal prisons and the people inside them did during major disaster. I was wondering if you had any more updates on the bill?
I am not sure if that has recently been raised again and where it went. I mean, I know it failed a couple years in a row. But, having that information would be a really great start because right now it's kind of a black hole. You ask for information about how facilities are impacted. And unless corrections departments are really compelled to share that information, they're not going to. Another interesting thing about that bill is that it would kind of encourage these departments to consider climate mitigation tactics that include decarceration, like sending people home, or sentence reductions. That might have been specifically aimed at federal prisons. I'm not totally sure, but
yeah, it was.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would be a decent start. Yeah, right now there's lots of studying happening, I think, starting to happen, and lots of maybe we should put air conditioning in here. But people and their family members and loved ones who are really at risk, it's every year, every day, it's really not enough.
Yeah. I also kind of wonder about the corrections officers. Sorry, to go back to the evacuations.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Like the stories you hear of cruelty in these prisons, I wouldn't be surprised if corrections officers were like, you know what, I'm just going to evacuate and I'm going to leave y'all here. It happened during Katrina. I'm sure it's happened other times. I don't know. Have you heard anything about that?
What I have heard is that a lot of facilities end up understaffed during, if a wildfire is coming through. People in Susanville, at the California Correctional Center, were saying that they were really understaffed because people were trying to get their family members safe. The corrections officers were. So they were calling into work. Also, in a lot of states, there's really bad issues with understaffing in prisons because corrections officers are really underpaid and the conditions are bad. So, yeah, Florida has a really dramatic problem with that right now. And one of the reasons that some of these states are actually talking about air conditioning in prisons is because they're having these staffing issues. And they think, that the heat might be a reason that they're struggling to retain officers.
Oh, that's a really good point. Yeah, because they got to be in there with all that heat all day, too.
Yeah, it's nasty.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I'm also hearing that in a lot of places, the corrections officers' areas are blasting air conditioning, and people are in there with coats on.
Oh my god!
If they have an office,
yeah, of course,
for them that where there is good climate control.
Oh my gosh! What a dick move!
Mm-hmm. That is a real dick move.
Yeah.
Oh god! Wow.
Yeah.
Well, Aline, what are you working on now? Anything you can tell us about that you're kind of looking at or tracking or particularly interested in kind of on this beat?
Yeah, right now, I guess I'm really one thing I'm interested in doing is just after having done this massive project, kind of using my knowledge of how to reach sources and to cover some of this stuff as it happens, So right now I'm trying to reach out to a lot of folks to hear about how they've been impacted by the heat this year.
Yeah.
I'm pretty interested in Texas and some of the, they do have a lot of heat mitigation measures in place that they've established because there were all these wrongful death lawsuits around 2011 or so. So instead of installing air conditioning in the facilities, they have these elaborate heat health scores and, respite areas and rules around water. But I think there's a lot of questions about how effective those really are. And whether some of the numbers around heat and health are accurate, So the Department of Corrections says that they have like hardly any illnesses in recent years, and I'm not so convinced of that. So I think that there's some reporting to do there. And, I think Texas gets a lot of attention, but states like Alabama and Florida also lack air conditioning and have a lot of people in really bad conditions. And so, I'm eager to kind of follow these climate crises in these prisons in real time as they hit. Obviously, we're getting into wildfire and hurricane season too. So, We'll see. And, you know, I think it's just an issue that it's really awesome that this isn't the first episode that you guys have done on this. Like, I think it's something that needs to be hammered over and over again, because these are people who are going to be left behind and forgotten as the climate crisis deepens, unless there's attention just repeatedly put on the system of mass incarceration and how it's faring under the climate crisis.
Yeah. Definitely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We were both really pumped that you were able to do it.
Yeah.
So very, very good to talk to you. Can't wait to see all the work that you'll be doing the rest of this year. And yeah, just appreciate everything you've done.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure. Depressing, but good to talk.
Yeah.
We like to say we're the cathartic climate podcast.
Yeah.
So that's the hot take guarantee. I said that last episode, and I'm going to keep saying it until we get complaints. Hot Take is a Crooked Media production.
It's produced by Ray Pang and mixed and edited by Jules Bradley. Our music is by Vasilis Fotopoulos. Thamali Kodakara is our consulting producer. And our executive producers are Mary Anais Hegler, Michael Martinez, and me, Amy Westervelt.
Special thanks to Sandy Gerard, Ari Schwartz, Kyle Seglin, and Charlotte Landis for production support, and to Amelia Montooth for digital support.
You can follow the show on Twitter at Real Hot Take, sign up for our newsletter at hottakepod.com, and subscribe to Crooked Media's video channel at youtube.com/crookedmedia.